In the spring of 1241, the Mongol army reached the outskirts of Vienna. They had already destroyed Poland. They had crushed Hungary in a battle that lasted less than 2 hours. They had burned city after city across Eastern Europe, and nothing, no army, no wall, no king, had managed to slow them down. The most powerful military force in the world was standing at the edge of Western Europe, and there was nothing left to stop them. Then they stopped, turned around, and rode back east. Not because they were defeated, not because they were afraid, not because Europe had found some way to resist. They stopped because their great Khan, Ogedei, had just died in Mongolia, 7,000 miles away, and every senior general in the army was required by Mongol law to return home for the election of a new leader. Europe was saved not by any army, not by any king, not by any act of courage or strategy or faith. It was saved by a funeral. And that tells you almost everything you need to know about the Mongol Empire. The Mongol Empire was the largest contiguous land empire in all of human history. At its peak in 1279, it covered 24 million square kilometers, roughly 1/5 of the entire land surface of the Earth. It stretched from the Korean peninsula in the east to the borders of Poland in the west, from the frozen tundra of Siberia in the north to the jungles of Vietnam in the south. It contained somewhere between 100 million and 150 million people, roughly 1/4 of the entire human population alive at that time. It was also gone, in unified form, within 50 years of its peak. And the reason it fell apart is not what most people expect. It wasn't defeated by a stronger enemy. It wasn't undone by plague or famine or some great catastrophe. The Mongol Empire collapsed for one reason above all others. It was simply too large for any human system to govern. To understand how this happened, you have to go back to the beginning. Temujin, the man who would become Genghis Khan, was born around 1162 into a minor Mongol clan on the steppes of Central Asia. His childhood was defined by hardship. His father was poisoned by rivals. His family was abandoned and left to starve. He was captured and enslaved. By any measure, his early life should have ended in obscurity. Instead, over the course of roughly 20 years, he united the fractious Mongol tribes through warfare, diplomacy, and a ruthless ability to build loyalty into a single force. In 1206, a great assembly of the Mongol clans declared him Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. What followed was the most explosive military expansion in recorded history. The Mongol army under Genghis Khan conquered more territory in 25 years than the Roman Empire accumulated in 400. They destroyed the Jin dynasty in northern China. They swept through Central Asia and Persia, sacking cities that had stood for centuries. They raided into Russia and Eastern Europe. They were so consistently overwhelming in open battle that their enemies began to believe they were supernatural. The Mongol military system had several genuine advantages. Their warriors were raised on horseback from childhood. They could ride and shoot simultaneously with a skill that no sedentary army could match. They moved faster than any army their enemies had ever faced, covering distances that seemed impossible. They mastered siege warfare by absorbing engineers from every civilization they conquered, and they were brutally effective at psychological warfare. They offered mercy to cities that surrendered and total destruction to cities that resisted. Most cities chose to surrender. By the time Genghis Khan died in 1227, the empire was already larger than anything the world had ever seen. His sons and grandsons kept expanding it. The westward push under his son Ogedei nearly reached the Atlantic. The southward push under his grandson Kublai eventually absorbed all of China. By 1279, the empire stretched 8,000 miles from end to end, and that was precisely the problem. Imagine trying to govern a territory that takes 8 months to walk across. Imagine receiving news of a rebellion in Persia and knowing that by the time your response arrives, 40 days of hard riding each way. 80 days will have passed. The rebellion will have succeeded or failed on its own. Your order will arrive as history, not as instruction. The Mongols understood this problem and tried to solve it. They built the yam, a relay postal system that was one of the genuine engineering marvels of the medieval world. Stations were placed every 25 miles across the empire, each stocked with fresh horses and riders. A message could travel 200 miles in a single day, far faster than anything else on Earth at the time. Marco Polo, who traveled through the system a generation later, called it one of the wonders of the world. But even the yam wasn't fast enough. Even at maximum speed, a round-trip message between Beijing and Persia took 80 days. Between Beijing and Poland, it took longer. In an empire this large, the speed of communication set a hard limit on the speed of governance. Decisions that needed to be made in days were being made in months. Crises that needed immediate response were receiving responses to situations that no longer existed. The military limits of the empire were equally revealing. The Mongol cavalry model, fast, mobile, overwhelming on open ground, worked brilliantly on the steppes of Central Asia. It began to fail everywhere else. In Japan, 2 massive invasion fleets were dispatched, one in 1274, one in 1281. Both were destroyed by typhoons that the Japanese would later call kamikaze, divine winds. 100,000 men were lost in the second invasion alone. In Vietnam, the Mongols invaded 3 times. Each time, the jungle heat, the rivers, and the guerrilla tactics of the Vietnamese army turned the campaign into a catastrophe. In Egypt, at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, the Mamluk Sultanate handed the Mongols their first major defeat in open-field combat, permanently ending the westward expansion. The empire that had never lost a major battle was discovering that the world was larger and more varied than the steppe model could handle. But the deepest problem was not military. It was demographic. At its peak, the Mongol Empire was governed by perhaps 2 million ethnic Mongols ruling over 100 million subjects who spoke dozens of languages, practiced a dozen religions, and had absolutely nothing in common with each other except the fact of conquest. The ratio was 50-1, 50 subjects for every Mongol ruler. And those 50 subjects included Chinese Confucians, Persian Muslims, Russian Orthodox Christians, Central Asian Buddhists, and everything in between. There was no common language, no common religion, no common culture. Nothing to tell the people of the empire why they should accept being governed by these rulers from the steppe, except the fact that those rulers had defeated them in battle. And military defeat, by itself, does not hold empires together for long. Genghis Khan had given the Mongols a governing principle of sorts. The concept of the Great Khan as universal ruler chosen by the sky god Tengri. But this had limited appeal outside the Mongol tradition. The Chinese, the Persians, and the Russians were not going to adopt Mongol shamanism as their organizing ideology. And then came the succession problem. Mongol tradition held that a leader's property was divided among his sons. This made sense for a herd of horses or a section of steppe. Applied to an empire of 24 million square kilometers, it was catastrophic. Genghis Khan divided his empire among his 4 sons, expecting a great Khan to coordinate them all. But every time a great Khan died, the entire empire had to stop while the clans assembled, argued, and elected a successor. And the elections were increasingly contentious because the stakes were increasingly enormous. By 1260, the contest for the Great Khan position between Kublai Khan and his brother Arik Bok had turned into an outright civil war. The unified empire fought itself. When the war ended, with Kublai victorious, the empire was no longer truly unified. The other 3 khanates, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Golden Horde in Russia and Eastern Europe, and the Ilkhanate in Persia, began operating as effectively independent states. They sometimes cooperated, sometimes traded, and sometimes went to war with each other. Within 2 generations, something even more profound happened. The Mongol rulers in each khanate began to dissolve into the cultures they had conquered. The Ilkhans in Persia converted to Islam. The Yuan rulers in China adopted Buddhist and Confucian practices. The Golden Horde adapted to the Russian steppe. Mongol children grew up speaking Persian, Chinese, or Arabic rather than Mongolian. They worshipped different gods. They ate different food. They wore different clothes. The empire had not been held together by any shared culture strong enough to survive contact with the much older, much deeper civilizations it had conquered. The Mongols had been too few and too culturally thin to absorb 100 million people without being absorbed themselves. By 1294, when Kublai Khan died, there was no single person who could claim to rule the whole empire. The last thread connecting the 4 khanates snapped. The unified Mongol Empire, the largest the world had ever seen, had lasted in that form for less than 35 years after its peak. Here is what the Mongol story teaches us. Military power and governing power are 2 entirely different things. One can be concentrated in a fast-moving army of skilled cavalry. The other requires communication, shared ideology, administrative infrastructure, and time. The Mongols solved conquest. They never solved governance. And at imperial scale, governance is the harder problem. Every large empire since has faced versions of the same challenge. The British Empire discovered that governing India from London was a fundamentally different problem from conquering India. The Soviet Union found that managing 15 republics with different languages, religions, and economic conditions from Moscow required a degree of centralized control that eventually collapsed under its own weight. Even modern multinational organizations face the governance at scale problem. The further from headquarters, the harder it is to maintain coherent direction. The Mongol Empire was not a failure. It was the greatest achievement in the history of military conquest. It reopened the Silk Road. It created the Pax Mongolica, a brief period of relative safety for trade across the entire Eurasian landmass. It connected civilizations that had never had direct contact. And in doing so, it inadvertently carried the Black Death from Central Asia to Europe, reshaping the Western world in a way no army ever had. But it could not hold itself together. The distance was too great. The diversity was too vast. The communication was too slow, and the ideology that bound the Mongols to each other, the shared identity of the steppe, the loyalty to the Great Khan, had no power over the 100 million people who had never chosen to be part of any of it. The empire that covered 1/5 of the earth lasted 35 years at its peak. It proved something that has been true in every age since. There is a maximum size at which any single human system can govern effectively. And the Mongols found that limit not by failing to reach it, but by shattering straight through it.